Thank you all very, very much for being here. Before saying any more, I just want to turn your attention to the screens. We're going to show you a little video graphic. Thank you very much. A little hard to see, but what that illustrates is the war in 2008 and Russia's invasion and occupation of Georgian territory has not ended. And in fact, the aggression continues in different form with the borderization, the seizure of new territory, and this continued pressure on society. We had a chance as part of the international delegation that's here to go visit the occupation line yesterday. You could stand there and look right across the valley at an FSB base with a Russian flag flying right there as this is what's happening inside Georgia today, this very day. So that's important context. Now, our conference this year is a very special one for a number of reasons. One of them is it is our fifth one. We invested in this 5 years ago for the first time, not knowing what would happen, and it has become a major gathering of U.S., European, West European, Central European, and Georgian foreign policy and national security leaders, people who are working together to try to help Georgia build the strongest, most prosperous, most secure democracy possible, and to try to help make sure that Europe and the United States remain focused on completing the job of a Europe whole, free, and at peace. No country should be left behind, and no people should be relegated to a situation of less safety than others in Europe or in the United States. It's also a special occasion because this is the first time we have a member of the McCain family with us here. We're delighted that Mrs. Cindy McCain is here. It's also special because this year we have the translation of Senator McCain's last book, The Restless Wave, translated into Georgian and available here. Thanks to Nino Yevgenidze and EPRC for making this happen and available today. Oops. It is also an interesting time because of the context. We have seen the hottest summer politically in Georgia since the war in 2008. We saw a Russian member of the Duma who supports independence of South Ossetia and Abkhazia take the seat of the speaker in the parliament. We saw massive protests against this. We saw those protests become violent and a violent police response and reaction to that. We've seen drastic changes in the media environment. We've seen changes to the intentions for elections next year in 2020. All of these things are now in the air. And then as of yesterday and today, we now have a new prime minister, new government in Georgia as well. Unfortunately, because of that, we will not have the usual presence of the prime minister at the beginning of our conference as we've had in past years. But it is important that we hear from all views, from civil society, from opposition, from government. It's important that people come together. And if I could also leave one thought with you that I hope becomes a theme throughout the conference. Georgia is a small country with some very serious challenges, and we saw that in the video graphic, real pressure from Russia. I like to say Georgia is a Central European country in a bad neighborhood. And we, as Georgians, it's a small country, 4 million people, it is too divided a society. People need to come together around higher national goals, around democracy, around the European aspirations of Georgia, the protection of the country, the sovereignty and territorial integrity of the country. It only serves the interests of the neighbor to the north for Georgians to be as divided as they have become. And I hope that the move towards elections next year, the change of the electoral law, proportional representation, all of these things that we're talking about can be seized by Georgians, by the people, by the voters, the public, by the government, by the opposition. Everybody seize this opportunity to make Georgia's democracy stronger and to demonstrate to yourselves as much as to the West, to the United States, that Georgia is making it and deserves all of the support and all of the engagement and all of the enfranchisement into a transatlantic community that Georgians aspire to. So I hope that becomes a theme that comes out of this conference: greater unity, less division. And let me add to that as well. With the McCain Institute, we launched a campaign in memory of Senator McCain at the end of August called Acts of Civility. And this is actually a very powerful idea, and I hope it takes root in Georgia as well. Civility in discourse, respect for those with whom you disagree, reaching out a hand to achieve goals together. The divisions in society, the increased vulgarity that we've seen in the United States, that we've seen in Western Europe, and that we can see in this country as well, make it harder to actually solve problems. And so I hope that we also see a return and an increase in civility in the discourse that we have. We have sponsors for our conference here, and we are very grateful to our sponsors. I want to just mention them once at the beginning here to thank them all. We want to thank NATO. We received funding from NATO to support this conference. The U.S. Embassy, the British Embassy, the Open Society Foundation, the Rooms Hotel, Tbilisi Bank, and the Bank of Georgia. So all of those sponsors, thank you. And if... Okay. And if I didn't mention your name, you have an opportunity next year. So, and with that, I'd like to invite to the podium Randy Schuneman, the Vice Chair of IRI and a close collaborator of Senator McCain throughout his career, and Mrs. Cindy McCain. So please.
Is this, yeah, this is working. Excellent. It's an honor to be back in Georgia and to talk a little bit before I introduce Cindy McCain about John McCain's legacy. John, in this book, calls me, thanks me for being his consigliere, which is a term that means close collaborator. It's often associated with a certain Italian crime family. In this case, it's one of the better things he called me. With John, if he wasn't insulting you, you weren't sure if he really liked you, for those of you that know him. But John, at his core, believed in American exceptionalism. He believed that America was both good and great, not without its flaws, but that the American experiment was something unique in human history, and that because we were blessed with the benefits of being part of that American experience, we had an obligation and a duty to support freedom around the world, to support those who didn't have freedom, to support those where freedom was jeopardized. And so many say authoritarianism is on the march now, and it certainly is in revanchist powers like Russia, China, and Iran. But freedom is still burning, even without strong American leadership in Algeria and Sudan and Ethiopia and Armenia, in elections yesterday in Putin's Russia, from Moldova to the Maldives, on the streets of Hong Kong and Caracas. And John believed we should do everything we can to support those that are willing to risk their own lives in support of pursuing their freedom. John also had a burning intellectual curiosity. I just finished General Mattis's new book, and he has a phrase in there that could come from the lips of John McCain, and that is, if you haven't read hundreds of books, you are functionally illiterate, and you will be incompetent because your experiences alone are not enough to sustain you. John McCain would always be carrying multiple books. I think one of his greatest fears was to be caught on a long airplane ride without something to read. He was always listening, always learning, never believed he was the smartest person in the room. John also knew when to fight. We all knew that about him, both when he wore the uniform and when he served in Congress and the Senate. But also, he knew when to compromise. He knew that elections were about differences, but that governing was about finding common ground. And I think his speech after losing the 2008 presidential election, congratulating President-elect Obama, is an excellent example of the civility that Kurt spoke of that my country, this country, and others need too much. And finally, John always believed in the underdog. Once peace in our time was going to be brought in 1938 because it wasn't worth fighting for a faraway country about which we knew little. For John, there were no faraway countries about which we knew little because he traveled to all of them. He learned from the people there, he learned about them, and he believed in the underdogs. And one of the famous stories, although I may have a twist that you haven't heard, from the 2008 campaign, very shortly after the invasion of this country by Russia, we were in, I believe, Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. Monday or Tuesday after the invasion was a Friday morning, and John said before this crowd in Harrisburg, in the heart of America, "We are all Georgians now. We stand with Georgia." And I was sitting next to Senator Joe Lieberman, and he said, "Boy, that's a powerful line. Did you give him that?" And I said, "No, that's John. That was John, all from the heart." And so what is his legacy? His legacy is IRI, where I am privileged to serve as vice chairman that supports democracy around the world. His legacy is the Halifax International Security Forum, founded after John called for an alliance of democracies, where I'm also privileged to serve. The McCain Institute, which bears his name, and that Cindy leads. And his legacy is each and all of us doing what we can to support freedom, intellectual curiosity, and the underdogs. And Cindy McCain, there's a lot of McCain in Cindy McCain. She is utterly fearless in traveling around the world to places that even NGOs are often reluctant to operate. Eastern Congo, Rwanda, refugee camps in Jordan. There's nowhere that Cindy won't go to stand up for refugees, to fight human trafficking. How many of you think if the NFL is having a Super Bowl in your hometown of Phoenix, Arizona, the first thing you would do is challenge the NFL to do something about human trafficking in Phoenix? Cindy did that. And so I'm pleased and honored to turn to Cindy and humbled for this opportunity to talk about John's legacy. Cindy.
Thank you, Randy. I'm so happy to be here, and Randy, you've done such a wonderful job, and you were such a good friend to John. I want to thank you for that. Your friendship meant a great deal to both of us, and the work that you do for democracy and freedom is something that people look to with honor and dignity. It's so nice to be in a place like this hotel and the buildings that are around us that are such a great representation of Georgian art, Georgian style, and Georgian freedom. This is exquisite, and I'm so glad that you invited me to come this year. I'm really happy to be here. As was mentioned, John believed that Georgia was in the vanguard of the struggle for the democratic future of the region, and in the front lines of resistance to Russian efforts to dominate its neighbors and undermine the progress of democratic institutions and the rule of law. He came here often, as you know, and I was privileged to be able to come with him several times. meeting with all of the Georgian Democratic governments, and he made a point of going to the line of Russian occupation and meeting with citizens displaced by the war. He often mentioned his affection and admiration for Georgians, for your spirited independence and your love of freedom. John was a great man, we all know that, who tried very hard to be a good man by being useful to those who needed his help the most. From Europe to Asia to Africa to the Americas, there are dissidents, freedom fighters, imprisoned journalists, democratic activists, mothers, fathers, struggling to make a better world for their children who knew that John McCain was their friend and their champion. He was never happier, never more satisfied, never more sure of himself than when he was fighting the bad guy to help the little guy. Something in him gave great empathy for the underdogs. Perhaps his own experiences in war, when he was deprived of his own liberty and his justice, it made him forever, ever after acutely sensitive to the opposition of others and the oppression of others. And given his lifelong love of a big fight, a good cause, he was quick to rush to their aid. 11 years ago, when Russian invaded and occupied Georgian territory, he famously declared, as Randy said, "We are all Georgians now," in the hope of encouraging the support of Americans and the West for what he called you then, brave little Georgia. He was, I think, and I hope you agree, your best and most outspoken advocate in the U.S. and perhaps even in the West. It wasn't only his affinity for the underdog that encouraged his steadfast solidarity with Georgians as they faced Russian aggression. He knew that a world where smaller nations were independent and democratic and safe from aggression from bigger nations was a safer world for all democracies, big and small, and he devoted himself to building just such a world. Many might look down on Georgia, he said, as a small, remote, and obscure place, and its fate not of significance to bigger, more powerful nations. But history is often made in remote, obscure places, he reminded us. He was with Georgians in life as you worked and fought to secure your independence and the blessings of liberty. He is with you in spirit now, as you struggle today. Were he here, he would encourage Georgians to work together to strengthen your democratic institutions and practices and to protect your national security. You can't afford to be divided in the face of continued Russian aggression. Whatever differences you have, preserving Georgia's independence and democracy should be your common and primary aspiration. John understood how hard such changes to achieve. He never viewed setbacks as a cause for despair, but as a call to arms. Wherever freedom faced aggression, he exhorted freedom's advocates to keep pressing, encouraging, and advancing human rights through every disappointment and reversal, in every corner of the world, until the day, no matter how distant, where every human being's dignity is valued and accorded equal respect by the governments and the laws of the world's nations. Because this is the purpose of democratic, accountable government and the rule of law, to respect and defend the dignity of all of God's children. It is one thing to recognize obstacles to change, he wrote, and to understand the world as it is with all of its corruption and cruelty. But it is a moral failure to believe tyranny and injustice are the inevitable tragedies of man's fallen nature. That there are some places in the world that will not change or aren't worth the effort to make better. They can be changed. They have been changed. My husband believed our common ideals are stronger and so much more important than our differences, and that we all have a common responsibility to defend and advance them that requires our occasional cooperation, and that cooperation requires us to treat each other with the civility that is a sign of respect for one another's intentions and dignity. He began his speech, as was mentioned, in accepting his party's nomination in 2008 by addressing his opponent, then Senator Barack Obama. "We'll go at it over the next 2 months," he acknowledged. "That's the nature of the business. And there are big differences between us. But you have my respect and my admiration. Despite our differences, much more unites us than divides us. We are fellow Americans, and that's an occasion that means, and that's an association that means more to me than any other. To behave civilly to people with whom you have disagreements and common responsibilities does not mean you have to be conflict adverse or accept the status quo you believe needs to be changed. It means that you have to respect the fact that those who disagree with you might be as well-intentioned as you are, as civic-minded and patriotic as you are, and as important to the success of the country's interests and ideals as you are. John always tried to give as good as he got in debates. He didn't believe the public arena was a place for meekness. I know that surprises all of you. But he did believe civility requires us to act with modesty, to see our own flaws as well as we see our opponents' weaknesses, and to see their strengths too. In what might be his most memorable speech in the Senate, delivered when he returned to Washington shortly after his cancer diagnosis, he lamented the polarization and paralysis that afflicts the institution he served in and loved for 3 decades, and the growing incivility that exacerbated those conditions. He was also quick to point out his own culpability in sustaining this regrettable status quo. Both sides have let this happen, he conceded. Let's leave the history of who shot first to the historians. I suspect they'll find we all conspired in our decline, either by deliberate actions or simple neglect. We've all played some role in it. Certainly I have. Sometimes I've let my passion rule my reason. Sometimes I've made it harder to find common ground because of something harsh I said to one of my colleagues. Sometimes I wanted to win more for the sake of winning than to achieve a contested policy. John was ambitious, and he had a temper, which sometimes got the better of him in public debates. But after that, of course, he would resolve to the fact that he's passionate, but also should be respectful. He had the modesty to know that it didn't serve the country or himself well to let his temper get the better of him. He tried hard to correct it, and sometimes with self-restraint, and sometimes when restraint failed, with sincere apologies after the fact. The anger some people in my country feel for people with opposing views seemed to have become more vitriolic and intense with the advent of the internet. At times, given the amplifying power of social media, our differences, which are fewer and less important than the shared values that that is supposed to unite us, appear to be all-consuming. Twitter isn't typically a showcase of modest self-awareness and political expression, and it doesn't encourage modesty among politicians or a readiness to see an issue from the opponent's perspective in the hope of finding a little common ground. Georgians remain in the vanguard of that profound and righteous transformation. He believed it was his privilege to stand with you, as do I. Thank you for honoring him and for letting me share a few thoughts about what Georgia meant to him and what I think he meant to you and what he believed Georgia meant to the world. Thank you for having me.